My name is Michael Vano, and I'm a consultant at Dev6. Welcome to the Dev6 TV webinar, where we will talk about structure and layout in Google Flutter. Now, for those of you who don't know about it yet, Flutter is Google's answer for developing native mobile application. Its main selling point is that you can develop code once and have it look the same in both iOS and Android. It does this by creating its own layer of visual elements, ignoring the native ones to iOS and Android. We will see this in the webinar later on.
All right, welcome everybody to Facebook Developer Circle presentations. My name is Michael Vano. I'm a consultant at Dev6, and my presentation today will be about Google Flutter. It's been gaining some traction lately, especially with the beta release. And this topic will just be scratching the surface a bit of what Google Flutter can do in regards to its structure and layout we got. So just a brief overview of what we'll be going through in this presentation. Just a quick introduction to Flutter for those of you who may not know what Google Flutter is. Widgets, what are they to Flutter? Looking at some of the code and structure that you have in Flutter. And closer to the end, we'll do some live demo and take some questions from everybody. All right, so quick introduction to Google Flutter here. So Google Flutter is Google's open source SDK for creating mobile apps, and it just recently went into beta as of February 27th. It's been in alpha for maybe about 8 months now, so a lot of people have gotten their hands on it, kind of messing around, and there's been many updates to it up till now. And with the beta release, there's been lots and lots of kind of blog posts we've been seeing going up. It uses the Dart language, which is Google's own programming language they use and have developed themselves. Everything is a widget in Flutter. Widgets are pretty much the building blocks in Flutter. It does come with a framework, which that in itself is a widget. And the framework is completely optional. It is something that you can use. You may choose not to use it. It is purely optional and completely up to you. And an interesting thing is that Google Flutter was actually inspired by React. A lot of the syntax they use and the structure looks very similar to React. So anybody who is very favorable of React and how it works, you might like Google Flutter. And just going through the steps to install and set up, I found it very easy to install it, especially following the instructions that Google has set up on their website. They have lots of great documentation, and their I guess their bug reporting is kind of active as well. I've submitted a few myself, and they have gotten great responses from the developers of them already. So. And it's not fully complete yet. I believe they are still working on it, but they are implementing assistive technology into Google Flutter, which I think the way things are going nowadays, I think is a great thing to have. And one last thing for the introduction, they have plugins for IntelliJ, which has been very helpful, especially in this setup. And they actually have the plugin be able to load up simulators from the IDE. So you can load up the iOS simulator. You can see in the screenshots here. You can open an iOS simulator. You can open an Android emulator, and you have different versions of it if you want. And the plugins have been extremely helpful in kind of working with and developing in Flutter. All right, so moving on to widgets. What are they? They are the building blocks of everything in Flutter. I personally like to think of them as Lego pieces. So you know how Lego pieces have all these various kinds of shapes, sizes, and putting them together, you can make very simple objects, or you can make very complex objects. Google Flutter, that's how I kind of test them too. They have all these different various widgets that you can use. Some are functional, some are styling. And just putting them all together, you can create your own application. Now, there are widgets for structure, style, and text. The way the Flutter works is that there is one parent widget, and the properties you set in that will filter down to any of its children. So any child widget of a parent widget will inherit all its properties, and it just keeps kind of filtering down through the entire hierarchy of all the widgets that are set up. And there's two types of widgets that every widget will extend from, which is a stateless or a stateful widget, which we will be getting into later on. So just going into some of the basic widgets we got here. So one is we have a text widget here. This one is used to just simply render text. And you can pass in an argument, and you can have it displayed dynamically if you want. The text widget typically is a stateless, and it acts dynamic and acts stateful just because of the way the argument can get passed in. And as you can see here, there's my mouse here. So as you can see here, so you have in the code, you have a new text, which this counts for a widget. And then you have the string you want to pass into a widget. You have the alignment, and then you have a style. Now, if you notice, that style also has a text style widget. So that widget has properties for how the text should be displayed. And so this kind of keeps going with the whole thing of everything is a widget, and it's very granular and modular. And on to the next widget. So this widget, these widgets, the row and column, these are widgets more for layout. Anybody familiar with CSS Flexbox? These essentially work the same way. So rows will align all the children widgets side by side horizontally, as you can see here with this increment button and the text here. They're laid out side by side with the row widget. And any column widget will be vertically stacked on top of each other. As you notice as well here, we have a main axis alignment, spaced evenly. Google Flutter has actually taken the CSS property names and used them here and created enumerations for you to use. With some slight variations, as you can see here, vertical direction is vertical direction up. If you compare that to CSS, it would be pretty much row reverse instead. So moving on, we got the stack widget. So this one is a little bit more interesting. This stack widget is essentially stacking widgets on top of each other. So it's kind of stacking on the Z layer. And all the widgets will kind of act like the stack widget itself is pretty much a box container. And all of its children will be stacked on top of each other based on the alignment that you set here. So you have alignment.center. If you had alignment top center, it would be aligned all to the top center or to the bottom. This is used primarily for kind of things like, you want to have a button with maybe, a circle as a base and maybe an icon on top of it and possibly a text underneath it. And this is good for kind of styling and stacking and creating these kind of objects that have layers and layers upon on top of each other, rather than say, maybe side by side, which is what the layout and columns are for. And the last widget we'll be looking at here, this one here is a container. So the container is pretty much just a very basic structural element. It is very similar to a div inside of HTML. So it's just a box. It's a container. It'll hold only one child. And you can use stylings very similar to CSS to adjust how it looks. As you can see here, I've set a height of 36. Now these values are kind of relative to the device they're on, so it's not necessarily pixels you'll be using. But in some cases, on some devices, it would be. And then you have padding, margin. A lot of these are very, they've taken the properties of CSS and used them as the property names in these widgets. And you have box decoration, which is more for colors and borders and the border radius. And then as you can see here, I have there's a center widget with a child of text. And as you can see, that's kind of how it would render out down here. All right, so moving on here, we have the code structure. Now, the Flutter app, when you build one, even a very simple one, as you can see here, you will use a lot of widgets. It just keeps going and going and going, and there will be a huge hierarchy of widgets that you will have to create. It's very similar to HTML, where you do have to keep building upon all the developments and keep nesting them and creating a very parent and child hierarchy between them all. And in the end, you eventually get a very beautiful application. And this one here is actually the stack example you saw earlier with the blue one here. So this one would just pretty much have the entire app with this text in the middle. That's something we'll be demoing later on. And as you can see, you have one container. This is the parent application, which has a child directionality. So this is a property of the application, something stating like how the text will be displayed. So in this case, it's left to right. You can also do right to left. And the main child, which is once again another container, which contains the colors, another child, which is the stack, and then it has more children, which is a bunch of text. So as you can see, it keeps just a huge hierarchy of widgets that you just keep building upon. Now, the two different types of widgets that you'd be essentially extending from, we'll be looking at here. So stateless widgets, these are mainly for just kind of visual descriptions or styles that you want to do. The state itself will not change. And these typically are for like texts or maybe display boxes, color, backgrounds, shapes, buttons, and these are immutable, so their states do not change. And excuse me, the syntax here, final, this is pretty much declaring a property of this widget that will not change. So the final syntax here, the code indicates that this variable will not change throughout the life cycle, throughout the life of this widget in the application. And as you can see here, the syntax looks very similar to something like C#, where they declare it before the variable name, and then the count is used within the text here. Now, stateful widgets, these guys are the ones that are dynamic. These tell the application that you do have a property that will get updated throughout the life of the application. And the reason Google Flutter has done this was to kind of create a very fast and responsive interaction with their applications. With stateful widgets, they know that, okay, there is going to be potentially a state change. So with stateless widgets, they don't have to worry about them. They're just always going to be that way. Whereas stateful widgets, they know, okay, something is going to change in this widget. So with here, whenever there's an interaction, it says, okay, increment, and the counter will be incremented by 1. And as you can see down here, there are two widgets, the counter, incrementer, and display. Now, both of these are actually stateless, so nothing changes with them. They are purely for display and interaction. But as you can see on pressed here for the counter increment, the method here, the function, gets passed in. So whenever the counter incrementer gets pressed, it'll call that function, and only in here is where it'll get updated. So the counter incrementer doesn't necessarily know what state this is in. It just has its own visual state, and nothing really changes. Kind of going off of that, if you did have a counter incrementer, say that like this would be a button. If you did have the button maybe change backgrounds, then that in itself would have to extend from a stateful widget rather than a stateless. But in this case, it's just stateless because all you do is just click on it and nothing really changes. Now, moving on to the layout. So this is essentially how a row and column layout will be set up. So you have one row parent here with its children widgets, each of them being a column. And then each of those columns have more children in them, which each has a text widget. So I've tried to highlight here kind of the containers and how they're working. And with the direction in each one, as you can see, the first column is kind of going in an up direction, the second one in a down direction, and the third one going from down to up. These are the kind of properties you can change within the widget, and it gives you freedom to kind of lay out however you want the your application to look. And once again, this is very reminiscent of Flexbox. So people knowing Flexbox, you should be able to understand this. And even people who are not familiar with Flexbox, using Flutter, excuse me, using Flutter may actually help you understand it better, because the rules here are a bit more strict, and you kind of have to follow the setup and the properties to get it to actually work how you want it to work. And another thing too is, as you'll notice with these structural layouts, or sorry, structural widgets, every time you use one, they essentially will always take up the entire space that they can, which is very reminiscent of Flexbox as well. So if you have this giant container here, this is actually taking up the entire screen of the application. So this row is just filling up the entire screen. Each of these columns fill up as much space as they can without kind of stepping on each other's toes. So it's just evenly divided between them all. And you have different properties like Flexbox to say how you want to arrange them and how you want to space them. Now, when I've been working with this code, I felt it feels like kind of creating a very complex JSON objects. It's essentially passing in and structuring a bunch of properties, within an argument for each kind of new widget you create. So as you saw before in the examples, with a very complex object, JSON object, you have the hierarchy kind of creating this giant pyramid. And if you can keep going like that, it'll become extremely huge. So that's why with complicated JSON objects, it feels like that kind of similar structure. And another cool thing I found is very interesting is most of the properties in Google Flutter for the widgets they have, if it is not of a number, Boolean, or string type, typically they will have some sort of enumeration for it. So as you can see here, the cross-axis alignment, this is for either a row or a column. And they give you an enumeration of this, so you have a whole list of values. And this really helps with the development because you don't necessarily have to keep going back to the documents to see, okay, what properties are available, what do I have to type in. They actually give it to you in an enumeration, and you can just pick and choose which ones you want. Now, some of them do work better with others. Some might not actually work at all, just because of maybe some properties you set up in a parent. But that's the kind of joy in kind of experimenting and messing around with Google Flutter and seeing what works together. And with the plugin for Dart and Google Flutter, the autocomplete really helps with this and always gives you a list of all these enumerations available for the property. Now, putting it all together, so here we have a scaffold widget. This scaffold is part of the material design framework. So you can use this, and it actually sets up a lot of properties that are kind of default. If you remember in the example before, I had a text direction. That's something that the scaffold kind of already sets up, so you don't have to worry about it. And it has all these existing properties that you can set. So like the app bar here, it's always at the top. Floating action button, you always got in the bottom right. And the body essentially takes up the entire space here. Now, if you were to take out the app bar at the top, the body would pretty much take up the rest of the space here. And then you can keep building your application and bringing in whatever you want for those. And once again, you don't have to use a scaffold. It's something that is helpful, but if you want to kind of, build your own app from scratch, it's totally possible. Flutter allows you to do that. All right, now moving on to the live demo, and if any questions come up for people, feel free to mention them in the comments.
And we'll show you exactly how Google Flutter works here. So we got the columns and the rows here. So this is a basic setup for Google Flutter. Now, as you can tell, this is exactly how it looks. So you have the column here, which represents this whole white space here. Everything's laid out in a column. And as you can see here, we got 3 rows, which you can say here, you got 1, 2, and 3 rows. And you can see the text here, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So we can see that when we change these rows to columns, we will now change the layout. And go back. Oops. Let's save it off here. Reloading, and as you can see, now they're all column, 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 all in one column. So you essentially have 3 columns in here. So another way we can do this is if we change it all to rows. So if we change this here to a row, now instead of a column, now everything will be aligned at the top in just one big row. So got 1 row up here and then 3 rows in that 1 row. As you can see here, the Google version didn't load up, so we'll just hot reload that. And oops, is that the correct one here? Here we go. Switch this here and give that a second. So it's just rebuilding here. Now, as you notice, when I was working in iPhone, it immediately reloaded itself very fast here, which is a really great feature about Google Flutter, is in that the hot reloading happens very fast. Google Flutter is able to do that because it only it only checks for anything that's been changed. Everything else remains the same, and it just checks for any instances that have been changed and then just re-renders those elements that have been changed. This is actually how the Google Flutter application works in itself. So we got the Google version now working the same way. Now we have this app bar at the top. Now this is part of Scaffold. So this is part of the framework, or one of the widgets that come part of this framework. So if we remove this, now the app bar pretty much represents this top bar here, which has, Flutter demo homepage. So if you remove that, or just comment it out here, reload that. So Android one is reloading. Yep, as you can see, it is now gone. And if we go for the iPhone SE here, this will hot reload it as well. Oops, we have to hit the reloading. Have to kind of bounce back and forth. There we go. So now, as you can see, the app bar is no longer there. Now, the thing is, with Google Flutter, as you can tell, whatever widgets you have, it'll just always take up the huge amount of the space. Sorry, not huge. It will just essentially fill up all the space that's left on the screen. So whatever top level widget you have will just always fill up the entire space. What's nice about the framework is with the app bar, it kind of has all the necessary spacing that is typical for mobile applications. So that's why that is usually helpful for that. Now, another thing you can see here, so the main axis alignment, spaced evenly. So these things are based off of CSS Flexbox. So we change this. So space evenly, you got space between, and this is on the top row. So we got everything here. Let's see, we are in iPhone, so the iPhone should reload. Okay. Oh, it's right here. It's probably be better split if we change this back to column. Okay. There we go. Oh, it's loading up in the Android here. So as you can see here, so everything is just spaced evenly as opposed to before where it's spaced between. Reloading, and give it a sec. Is that the correct one? Here we go. I think I repeated that one there. There we go. So everything's spaced evenly apart from each other. And the one before was spaced between. So a lot of these elements and enumerations are based off CSS, a Flexbox. And as you can see, if I hit main axis alignment here, you can see all the various enumerations available to use. This is very helpful when trying to figure out and, kind of playing around with Google Flutter. You can always just kind of check out what the enumerations are. You don't have to always refer to the documentation, which, by the way, the documentations are really great. So as you can see, when you changed it, everything to the center, everything got squished into the center here. And you can, keep playing around with here. Start, everything is, going to be at the top of the page here. And so on. So all the different kind of values you can play with around here. So we're just going to bring it back to space evenly. And we'll bring the app bar back in. Okay, and as you can tell, like, the hot reloading it's very fast, especially if you're working in one with one device. As you can see, sometimes it doesn't always reload in both, but that's something where you can just kind of trigger the hot loads, select the device you want to work with up here, and it will reload itself. As you can see, that was probably took maybe a few seconds here. So working with Flutter locally is very nice with the hot reload feature that they have built in. So another thing here is the build context. This build context is essentially kind of a reference for the entire application that kind of dictates what kind of theme it is, right? So as you can see here, this context gets transferred to the themes. Now these things it's very helpful because you can specify your themes and it will filter down through all the widgets that you have within your application. So this is, very top level parameters that you set. So stylings, colors, sizes, that kind of stuff. And it'll just be available for all the widgets as it goes throughout the application. So something that, you can change there and will filter through all the different widgets. What I'm currently using here, this is the stylings here are based off of material design. There is also Cappuccino available, which is more of the iOS look and feel. So, if you're playing around with Flutter, you prefer the look and feel of iOS components as opposed to material design, you can integrate Cappuccino instead. Now, with Google Flutter, because they create their own layer and they draw their own elements on top of in that layer, they're able to have the same look and feel between both iOS on the left here and Android OS. As you can see, they look very similar. The colors are pretty much identical. The layout, the look, the feel, the alignment here, that might be by design for Android and centered for iOS. It could be, an intentional thing that they've set up. But essentially, most of the layouts here, as you can see, are quite the same. And that's something that, a lot of the other native frameworks, it's a challenge for developers to kind of change the layout and try to make it look the same on both. And because they use the native elements for iOS or Android, it becomes difficult because they each have their own stylings. So Google Flutter essentially bypasses that, creates their own layer, and draws their own elements on that layer, meaning that it'll just look the same on both iOS and Android. Now, it's just the visuals that are the same. Google Flutter still gives you access to all the native features of a phone, whether you can, access the camera, access GPS, access the phone. All those are still accessible. You just may need some sort of, conditional statement if certain features on iOS as opposed to Android, or vice versa. If there's something specific to Android that's not available to iOS, that does happen. But at least you don't have to worry about the visuals. You don't have to do any conditional statements to say this will look like this on iOS and this will look like this on Android. And even though they look the same, you might have to do conditional statements in other frameworks. So with Google Flutter, you don't have to worry about that. Now, going on to a different type of layout or widget that we have. Now, because I'm going to be changing the entire application, the hot reloading doesn't really pick that up as nicely. As I mentioned before, that the hot reloading just listens and watches individual little widgets. Because I'm changing the entire application, this is something where you would have to reload the entire application. So I'm just looking for the correct one here. Yeah, so this is the one with the stack. Okay. So, yeah, see, so you get a little notification, reload performed. So if we just run this again to kind of build from scratch, do it for both of them. Yeah, it's just giving us a notification that it's not going to hot reload as easily. Oops. I think this was just a little spare here, so can't have two main methods. Okay, so I'm missing something here. So let's see here. Run app new container. I have to run it again here. And let's give it a second here to reload again. Yeah, when you change the entire kind of main application, it does take a while to kind of pick it up again. There you go. So as you can see, everything is now purple. This is a different thing. So it looks like iOS is still loading up here. Might have to Okay, it's over there. Oh. Just gonna try to restart the iPhone here. But in the meantime, we can look at the Android one. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so what's on display here is the stack widget, which essentially works like a position absolute in HTML5 and CSS. So what this essentially does is it's a widget that contains multiple children, and all those children essentially are just stacked on top of each other. So if you can make out the text here, if you look down here, they're just kind of all jumbled up on top of each other. And with more properties and attributes, you can adjust where they are, kind of top, left, down. Backgrounds here, colors, you can choose. Once again, the enumeration in effect here, you can have a look at what's available, and they even give you a little thing on the right side here where that color is coming from. So we can do something like a blue background, get that loaded up. No, didn't reload. Okay. Sometimes they give you a warning, you might have to restart it. Thankfully, it doesn't take too long to restart. So you can change this, and you can change it to an orange as well. And you can just always play around with the colors, see what works. This is something we have to reload again. Yeah. So, and then this is the stack widget here, and you can see the alignment is in the bottom center, so which is bottom center here. And we can just change that as well. It's like, if you want it absolutely in the middle here, this is something useful for, elements you just want right in the middle of the screen. And when you stack things, you can, have an image with text on top of it or however you want. So, so you have it in the middle there. Now, if we bring it over to the Android version, get that going. Let's get it going. It looks like it's starting up to Gradle again. Yep. Okay, there we go. So now they're both working again. So you have the center here. So as you can see, once again, the styles are very similar. Maybe some colors are slightly off, but the look and feel are essentially the same. So here you can always do, play around once again with all the different illustrations they have. So, top center, that should bring it up to the top middle right here once it's done reloading, if it has reloaded. Yeah. So I need to hit that sucker again. Here with the iPhone, let's see if it's slightly faster too for demoing purposes. Picked up. So as you can see here, it is now in the top center. So that is a sample of how the stack widget works. Now, once again, I'm gonna change application. So once again, I'll probably have to reload everything up and just clean up some of these sessions going on. Okay, so the last interaction or last application I wanted to show here is just some basic interaction. Let's see here. Here. So this one just kind of displays something kind of from the Flutter tutorial where it has a button that increments as you click on it. Let's just load them all both up here. So once again, the iPhone kind of starts a bit faster here, since the Android has to run through SDK and load up the studio. But as you can see here, as you click on the button, counter increments. And once again here, very similar look and feel. You click on it and it increments. So these are kind of all the pieces here. So you have the counter display, which shows the number here. And you have the incrementer, which as you press it, it increments here. So you have the text here, on press, and we pass in the on press function, which increments here. So as you can see here, this counter class, which is a widget, is essentially this whole area, which is a row. So it's aligned this way, and the alignment is spaced evenly. As you can see, they have even spacing around them, and it has two children, the incrementer, which is the button here, and the actual display, which shows the counter. And as you can see, the incrementer here, we pass in the method that we want to call every time it is clicked. So it increments the counter gets updated, and gets displayed with the count, and the increment text here has a method on pressed, and it all works together to create the interaction. So this is just the just scratching the surface of what Google Flutter can do, just very simple layouts. You can always look at the documentation that they have online. They've done a very good job at documenting all these different cases, and they're constantly updating it as well. So that's the end of the live demo here. Thank you for watching. We hope you've enjoyed this Dev6 TV video about Google Flutter's structure and layout. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or get help from Dev6 regarding full stack training or custom app development, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And for you students out there, if you want to find out more information about our training and consulting services, you can visit our website at dev6.com. Thanks for watching our video.